Still wearing that bargain bin uniform at 29? Robert Walker's voice carried across the banquet hall, light with laughter, sharp with judgment, and Ethan Walker felt every pair of eyes turn toward him as his mother added, "Your brother closed a six-figure deal this week, and you're still playing soldier," and although the words were meant as a joke, the laughter that followed was not gentle, it was the kind that lingers too long in the air, the kind that quietly labels a man before he has the chance to speak, and Ethan stood there in his worn dress blues, the fabric at the elbows slightly faded, the hem brushed thin from years of service, his medals polished but modest, his posture straight as a steel beam set in concrete, because he had learned a long time ago that dignity does not answer mockery, it outlasts it. The Walker family reunion had been moved this year to the Jefferson County Civic Center, a wide ballroom with cream-colored walls and round tables draped in white linen, the kind of place rented for wedding receptions and retirement dinners, and Linda Walker had insisted everyone dress presentable, though when Ethan arrived after driving nearly 300 miles from Fort Bragg in his aging pickup truck, still carrying the faint scent of motor oil and road dust, she had glanced at him and sighed as if he had confirmed something she had always suspected. His older brother, Daniel, wore a tailored navy suit and Italian shoes that caught the light every time he crossed his legs, and conversations around him seemed to orbit around bonuses, markets, and new construction projects outside Charlotte, while Ethan's stories, when he was asked for them at all, were reduced to vague questions about pay and housing allowances, as though his life could be measured in square footage and base salary alone. When Robert's laughter faded, he shook his head and said, "Son, when are you going to settle down and get a real career? You're not getting any younger," and the words settled over the table heavier than the prime rib on their plates, but Ethan did not flinch, he did not defend himself, he simply adjusted the crease on his sleeve and let the silence form its own answer, because he knew something his parents did not, something he had never felt the need to parade in front of them. Like a trophy. Over the past 8 years, Ethan had led men through training exercises that demanded precision and patience. He had stood watch in places where the night stretched long and quiet and the responsibility for others rested squarely on his shoulders. He had written letters to families and stayed up until dawn reviewing logistics so that younger soldiers could rest a little easier. And yet none of those things translated easily into the language spoken at this table, the language of quarterly returns and gated communities and early retirement plans. Linda leaned closer to one of her friends and whispered loudly enough to be heard, "We always hoped he'd do more," and Daniel offered an embarrassed smile as if Ethan's presence required apology, and still Ethan remained still, his jaw relaxed, his eyes steady, because he had discovered that the loudest rebuttal is sometimes restraint. Near the back of the ballroom, beneath a banner honoring local service members, a tall man in a dark suit stood observing the room with a composure that suggested authority rather than curiosity, his silver hair neatly combed, 4 stars pinned discreetly to the lapel of his jacket, and while most guests had not yet noticed him, he had noticed Ethan the moment the laughter began, had noticed the way the young staff sergeant did not shrink, did not argue, did not lower his gaze, and something about that quiet steadiness seemed to hold more weight than any boast ever could. Ethan picked up his water glass and took a slow sip, letting the noise of the room blur into the background hum of clinking silverware and polite conversation, and for a brief second he allowed himself to breathe deeply, to feel the fabric of his uniform against his shoulders, to remember why he wore it in the first place, not for applause, not for approval, but for something far less visible and far more enduring. And as he set the glass back down, the tall man at the back of the hall began to walk forward, each step deliberate, each movement measured, and the air in the room seemed to shift in a way no one could yet explain. The sound of quiet conversation continued to ripple across the ballroom as the tall officer made his way between the tables, and most guests assumed he was simply greeting sponsors or local officials. Yet his gaze never drifted far from Ethan Walker, who remained seated with his shoulders squared and his expression calm, as though the remarks made only moments earlier had dissolved into nothing more than background noise. Robert Walker cleared his throat and attempted to reclaim the attention of those around him by launching into another story about Daniel's recent promotion, his voice animated, eager to restore the balance of admiration at the table, while Linda nodded enthusiastically and added details about a planned vacation to Napa Valley, carefully curated examples of success that fit neatly into their understanding of accomplishment. Ethan listened without interruption, folding his hands loosely in front of him, the faint sheen of his service ribbons catching the overhead lights, and though no one at the table asked what his current assignment involved, he felt no urge to fill the silence with explanations, because over the years he had grown accustomed to the assumption that if something could not be measured in profit margins or property values, it held little weight in this room. The officer stopped a few feet away, speaking briefly with the event coordinator before turning his full attention toward the Walker table, and a subtle hush began to spread outward like a slow wave across the ballroom, silverware pausing midair, conversation softening into curious murmurs. Daniel noticed first, straightening his tie and whispering to his mother that someone important seemed to be approaching, and Linda instinctively adjusted her necklace as if presentation alone could prepare her for recognition. Ethan rose politely as the officer reached their table, his movements controlled and deliberate, and for a moment there was no introduction, no dramatic announcement, only a steady exchange of eye contact that seemed to carry its own unspoken understanding. The officer's face held neither amusement nor judgment, only a measured respect that contrasted sharply with the laughter that had filled the room earlier, and when he extended his hand toward Ethan, the gesture was simple yet unmistakable. Robert forced a polite smile and began to introduce himself, but the officer's attention remained fixed on his son, asking in a calm, even tone how long he had been stationed at Fort Bragg and whether he was still overseeing the training unit that had recently received commendation for operational excellence. The questions were specific, informed, and left little doubt that this was not a casual encounter. Ethan responded modestly, confirming his assignment without elaboration, and the officer nodded once as though confirming something he had already known. Around them, guests began whispering, recognition dawning as someone quietly identified the 4 stars pinned to the officer's lapel, and the room seemed to recalibrate its perception in real time. Linda's earlier expression of mild embarrassment shifted into confusion, then into something closer to disbelief, while Robert's confident posture faltered just slightly as he realized that the man standing before them carried a rank reserved for only a handful of leaders in the entire country. Yet Ethan's demeanor did not change. He did not glance triumphantly at his parents or seize the moment to defend himself, he simply stood with the same steady composure he had maintained all evening, allowing the conversation to unfold without theatrics. The officer's voice remained calm as he spoke of discipline, integrity, and the quiet strength required to lead others without seeking applause, words that seemed directed at Ethan yet audible to everyone within earshot, and in that measured tone there was an unmistakable acknowledgement of value that could not be dismissed or laughed away. As the murmurs grew and the atmosphere shifted from casual celebration to attentive silence, Ethan felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders, not as a burden but as a reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place, and while his parents sat frozen between pride and confusion, he understood that the evening was no longer defined by a joke at his expense but by a quiet recognition that required no defense and no explanation. The officer allowed the silence to settle before speaking again, and when he did, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard without raising it, explaining that leadership is not measured by applause but by the willingness to shoulder responsibility when no one is watching, and as he spoke he kept his eyes on Ethan, not in praise that demanded attention but in recognition that required none. A few guests shifted in their seats, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something more than a polite exchange, and the earlier laughter now felt misplaced, almost fragile in memory. Robert attempted to recover his footing by extending his hand and offering a stiff introduction, emphasizing his own years running a regional contracting business as if status could be recalibrated through proximity, but the officer acknowledged him with a courteous nod before returning his focus to Ethan, asking about the training initiative that had recently improved readiness metrics across multiple units and how it had been implemented under tight timelines and limited resources. The specificity of the questions left no room for exaggeration or dismissal, and it became evident that this was not second-hand praise but informed respect. Ethan answered in steady, concise sentences, crediting his team, emphasizing preparation and accountability, and avoiding any tone that might suggest self-promotion, because he understood that confidence does not require embellishment. Linda sat very still, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the tablecloth, her earlier comments about doing more echoing in her own thoughts as she watched the room recalibrate around her son. Daniel, who had been the reliable benchmark of success for years, remained silent, his polished composure now uncertain as he realized that achievement can take forms that do not fit neatly into financial statements or social media announcements. The officer then turned slightly, addressing the surrounding guests with a measured explanation that the strength of a community rests not only in visible accomplishments but in the quiet commitment of those who choose service over spotlight, and although he did not reveal operational details or recount dramatic episodes, the weight of his acknowledgement carried more substance than any story ever could. When he finished, he stepped back just enough to create a moment that felt suspended in time, and without theatrical flourish he brought his hand to his brow in a precise, deliberate salute directed solely at Ethan, a gesture rooted in respect rather than ceremony. The room froze. Conversations halted. Even the clinking of glassware seemed to fade into the background. In that silent exchange there was no need for explanation, no need for defense, only the unmistakable signal that the man who had been quietly judged a few minutes earlier stood in the esteem of someone whose rank represented decades of earned authority. Ethan returned the salute with equal precision, his movements disciplined and calm, his expression unchanged, because he had not come seeking validation, and the moment did not inflate him, it simply affirmed what he already knew about the path he had chosen. Robert's confident posture gave way to stillness, his earlier amusement replaced by an awareness that the metrics he had relied upon were incomplete. Linda's eyes glistened not from spectacle but from recognition, as though she were seeing her son in full dimension for the first time. Around them, whispers shifted in tone from curiosity to admiration, and the narrative that had formed around Ethan over the years began to dissolve without confrontation or accusation. The officer lowered his hand and spoke one final sentence, expressing appreciation for the kind of character that does the right thing consistently, whether anyone notices or not, and then he turned to greet other guests, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than applause. Ethan resumed his seat slowly, adjusting the crease of his sleeve with the same composed attention he had shown all evening, and while no one at the table knew exactly how to bridge the distance between their earlier remarks and this new reality, he did not rush to fill it, because he understood that respect imposed by force fades quickly, but respect revealed through quiet acknowledgement endures. The weight of the moment did not explode into applause or dramatic declarations, it settled instead into a steady, unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of the room, as though an invisible scale had quietly recalibrated itself, and when Ethan lowered his hand from the salute and resumed his seat, he did so with the same measured composure he had carried all evening, neither inflated by recognition nor diminished by the memory of mockery. Robert cleared his throat, the sound thin against the lingering silence, and attempted a strained chuckle as if the previous remarks could be reshaped into harmless humor, but no one joined him this time, and the effort faded quickly, replaced by a stiffness that felt unfamiliar on a man who had always controlled the narrative at his own table. Linda's gaze remained fixed on her son, studying the lines of his face, the steadiness in his posture, the quiet confidence that had not wavered before or after the officer's gesture, and for the first time she seemed to realize that the uniform she had dismissed as worn carried more meaning than any designer suit in the room. Daniel shifted in his chair, loosening his collar slightly as conversations at neighboring tables resumed in softer tones, now threaded with a different kind of curiosity, and he offered Ethan a nod that held less comparison and more acknowledgement, as if an unspoken rivalry had quietly dissolved. The general continued greeting other guests, but the echo of that precise salute lingered like a subtle imprint across the evening, and Ethan could feel the difference in the way people looked at him, not with spectacle or exaggerated admiration, but with a recognition that had weight. He reached for his water glass once more, taking a slow sip, allowing the cool clarity to ground him in the present moment, because despite the shift in perception, he remained the same man who had driven 300 miles in a pickup truck that had seen better days, the same man who rose before sunrise to review training schedules and ensure that every detail under his supervision was accounted for. Robert finally leaned forward, his voice lower now, asking quietly about Ethan's current responsibilities, not as a challenge but as a genuine inquiry, and the difference in tone did not go unnoticed. Ethan answered simply, describing long hours, strategic planning, and the importance of preparing others to succeed, speaking without embellishment, because he had never needed to magnify his role to understand its value. Linda listened closely, her earlier comments echoing faintly in her mind, and when she spoke, her words were softer, less certain, as she admitted that she had not fully understood what his commitment required. Ethan did not correct her, did not recount the nights of exhaustion or the weight of decisions that affected dozens of lives. he only nodded once, acknowledging the effort behind her words without demanding more. Around them, plates were cleared and coffee was poured, the ordinary rhythm of the banquet resuming, yet something fundamental had changed at their table, an awareness that respect does not always arrive wrapped in visible success, sometimes it stands quietly in a well-worn uniform and waits for the world to catch up. Ethan glanced toward the far end of the ballroom where the general now stood speaking with local officials, and he felt no urge to approach again or extend the moment, because validation had never been his objective. What mattered to him had always been internal, rooted in discipline, purpose, and the knowledge that integrity holds steady whether it is noticed or not. As the evening continued, Robert's posture gradually softened, the rigid confidence replaced by reflection, and Linda reached across the table to rest her hand lightly on Ethan's sleeve, a gesture small but sincere. He met her eyes briefly and offered a faint, respectful smile, not triumphant, not vindictive, simply present. The laughter from earlier felt distant now, almost unreal, as though it belonged to a different room, a different version of the night, and Ethan understood that while perceptions can shift in a single moment, character is built over years of quiet consistency. When he eventually rose to leave, adjusting the crease of his trousers and buttoning his jacket with practiced precision, he did not rush, did not linger for praise, he simply prepared to return to the road, knowing that tomorrow would look much like yesterday, disciplined, structured, steady, and that was more than enough. The drive back to his parents' house was quiet, the late evening air cool against the windshield of Ethan's pickup truck as the city lights faded behind him and the familiar two-lane highway stretched ahead for miles, illuminated only by the steady beams of his headlights and the occasional passing sign marking distance in small white numbers. He had declined the invitation to stay longer at the banquet, offering a respectful handshake to the host and a brief nod to the general before stepping outside, because lingering in admiration had never been his instinct, and as he guided the truck onto the road, he felt the same grounded calm that had carried him through far more demanding days. The uniform jacket rested neatly in the passenger seat, carefully folded, its fabric worn but maintained with quiet pride, and he glanced at it once before returning his focus to the asphalt ribbon ahead, understanding that respect earned does not need to be replayed in memory to remain real. When he reached his parents' house, a modest brick home set back from the road with a wide oak tree shading the front yard, he noticed the porch light still on, casting a warm glow across the driveway as though someone had been waiting. He parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a brief moment in the silence, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing evenly, not anticipating confrontation or apology, only the continuation of a relationship that had subtly shifted. Inside, Robert stood near the kitchen counter, a cup of coffee untouched beside him, and Linda was seated at the table with her hands folded, both of them rising when Ethan entered. The air felt different from earlier in the evening, less certain, less performative, and Robert spoke first, his voice steady but stripped of the confidence that had once defined it, admitting that he had underestimated what his son's path required and that perhaps he had measured success too narrowly for too long. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression composed, not defensive, not triumphant, simply attentive. Linda stepped closer and reached for his hand, her touch gentle, and said that she had not realized how much responsibility he carried, how much discipline it took to remain committed year after year without public applause, and her words were not dramatic, they were simple, but they held sincerity. Ethan nodded once and replied that he had chosen his path willingly, that he had never needed comparison to understand his purpose, and that he respected the work his brother did just as he respected his own, because worth is not a competition but a matter of character. Daniel, who had followed them home in his own car, entered quietly and offered a firm handshake rather than a casual pat on the back, acknowledging without elaboration that the evening had revealed more than anyone had expected. They stood together in the kitchen, not in celebration but in reflection, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between pauses in conversation, and for the first time in years the discussion centered not on salary or property or milestones, but on values, on integrity, on the steady consistency required to lead without spectacle. Later, when Ethan prepared to leave for the long drive back to base, Robert walked him to the porch, the night air crisp and still, and placed a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that carried weight without words. There was no grand apology, no dramatic reconciliation, only a quiet recognition that respect had shifted direction. Ethan thanked him for the evening, not with irony but with sincerity, because he understood that growth often arrives quietly, just as recognition had earlier that night. As he pulled away from the curb, the porch light remained on behind him, smaller with distance yet steady, and he felt no need to replay the salute or the silence that followed, because what mattered was not the moment itself but what it had revealed. The road ahead was long, nearly 300 miles back to Fort Bragg, but the drive did not feel heavy. He adjusted the rearview mirror, set the cruise control, and allowed the rhythm of the highway to steady his thoughts, aware that tomorrow would bring early training briefings and logistical reviews, the ordinary responsibilities that had always defined his days. He did not expect the world to change overnight, and he did not need it to. What had shifted was quieter than public admiration, more durable than applause. It was the understanding that true worth does not rise and fall with opinion, and that the strongest response to doubt is not argument but consistency. As the dark horizon widened before him and the stars appeared faintly above the open fields, Ethan drove forward with the same calm determination that had carried him all along, knowing that recognition, when it comes, is not the destination but simply a reflection of the path already walked. By the time Ethan reached Fort Bragg, the horizon was beginning to lighten, a pale gray line stretching across the North Carolina sky as dawn prepared to settle over the base, and he guided his pickup through the security gate with the same quiet focus he carried into every new day, offering identification, exchanging a brief nod with the guard, and continuing forward without ceremony. The familiarity of the place grounded him instantly, rows of buildings lined with discipline and routine, flags already stirring faintly in the early breeze, and he felt the steady rhythm of responsibility returning in full, not as pressure but as purpose. He parked near the training facility, stepped out, and retrieved his uniform jacket from the passenger seat, brushing a careful hand over the fabric before slipping it back on, adjusting the collar with practiced precision. The events of the previous evening did not replay in his mind with excitement or resentment, they rested quietly in the background, like a distant echo that had already served its purpose. Inside the operations building, fluorescent lights hummed overhead as junior officers reviewed schedules pinned to bulletin boards and checked off logistics for the day's exercises, and when Ethan entered, conversations paused briefly out of respect rather than spectacle. He acknowledged them with a calm greeting, his tone steady, asking about readiness reports, equipment inspections, and projected training timelines, because leadership, to him, had always meant focusing forward rather than looking back. A young lieutenant approached with questions about coordinating multiple units across a 2-mile stretch of terrain during the afternoon exercise, and Ethan listened carefully, offering clear instructions and measured guidance, emphasizing preparation, communication, and accountability, the fundamentals that had shaped his own approach. There was no mention of banquets or salutes, no shift in his demeanor that suggested he had experienced anything unusual, because he understood that credibility is built through consistency, not through isolated moments. As the morning unfolded, he moved through the facility with deliberate efficiency, reviewing documentation, ensuring that safety protocols were understood, and taking the time to speak individually with several soldiers who had recently joined the unit, learning their names, their backgrounds, and their aspirations, because he believed that respect begins with attention. At midday, he stepped outside for a brief pause, the sun now fully risen, casting sharp lines of light across the pavement, and he allowed himself a single quiet breath of reflection, not on the recognition he had received, but on the responsibility that came with it. He knew that titles and ranks carry weight, yet they mean little without integrity to support them, and the silent acknowledgement from the night before had not changed who he was, it had simply illuminated what had already been there. Later, as he gathered his team for a concise briefing, he spoke about discipline and trust, about the importance of doing the right thing even when no one is present to observe it, and though he did not reference his personal experiences, the conviction in his voice carried lived understanding. The soldiers listened attentively, sensing authenticity rather than performance, and when the briefing concluded, they dispersed with clarity and confidence. As the afternoon progressed and the training exercise unfolded across the measured miles of open field, Ethan remained observant and composed, making adjustments where necessary, offering guidance without raising his voice, embodying the steady leadership he valued. When the day finally drew toward evening and paperwork replaced field coordination, he sat alone for a moment in his office, the muted hum of the building around him, and he recognized that growth does not arrive in loud declarations, it emerges quietly through reflection and consistency. His phone vibrated once with a short message from his father, simple words expressing pride without embellishment, and Ethan read it carefully before setting the device down, not because he needed affirmation, but because he understood the significance of humility in both directions. Outside, the flag lowered slowly against the fading sky, and as he stepped out into the cooling air, he felt the same steady calm that had defined him long before any public acknowledgement, aware that respect earned is not a single moment but a lifelong practice carried forward one disciplined day at a time. The weeks that followed settled into a steady rhythm, yet something subtle had shifted beyond the boundaries of the base and the highway that connected it to his parents' home, and Ethan became aware of it not through dramatic conversations but through small, deliberate changes that carried quiet weight. His father began calling once a week, not to compare achievements or measure salaries, but to ask thoughtful questions about leadership, about the kind of preparation required to coordinate multiple units across miles of terrain, about how trust is built among people who rely on one another without hesitation. The tone of those conversations was different from anything Ethan had heard before, less evaluative and more reflective, and he answered with the same calm clarity he used in briefings, careful not to exaggerate, careful not to minimize, because he understood that respect must be handled with the same discipline as responsibility. His mother mailed a small package one afternoon, a neatly folded American flag she had kept stored in the attic for years, accompanied by a handwritten note explaining that it had once belonged to his grandfather and that she believed it belonged with someone who understood its meaning. Ethan held the fabric for a long moment in his office, the weight of it symbolic rather than heavy, and he felt a quiet gratitude that did not require grand expression. On base, life continued without fanfare, early mornings marked by structured drills and detailed planning sessions, afternoons spent reviewing progress reports and mentoring younger soldiers who watched him not because of any story that had traveled beyond the banquet hall, but because they recognized steadiness when they saw it. One evening, after a long training cycle concluded successfully, Ethan remained behind in the operations building, reviewing notes and making small adjustments to future schedules, when a junior officer approached and thanked him for leading without raising his voice, for correcting mistakes without humiliation, for showing that authority does not need to be loud to be effective. Ethan accepted the comment with a simple nod, because he had learned that influence grows strongest in quiet soil. Meanwhile, back in Jefferson County, Robert attended a local business gathering where conversations drifted toward career paths and community contributions, and for the first time he found himself speaking of his younger son without qualifiers or comparisons, describing not the rank or the uniform, but the character he had witnessed that evening, the composure under scrutiny, the dignity that had not wavered. The words felt different in his mouth, less like pride borrowed from status and more like recognition earned through understanding. Linda, too, began sharing stories with neighbors about the discipline she had come to admire, recounting how Ethan had stood quietly rather than argue, how acknowledgement had arrived without demand, and in retelling it she realized that what had impressed her most was not the salute itself but the restraint that preceded it. Months passed, measured not in dramatic events but in consistent effort, and when Ethan returned home again for a short visit, the atmosphere in the house felt lighter, less charged with expectation, more grounded in genuine curiosity. There were no grand apologies revisited, no need to dissect the past, only a shared meal at the kitchen table where conversation flowed naturally, touching on training schedules, Daniel's new project, and Linda's garden, each topic given equal respect. At one point Robert looked across the table and said quietly that leadership must begin at home, and Ethan met his gaze with steady acknowledgement, understanding that growth had unfolded on both sides. Later that evening, as he stood on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, the oak tree casting long shadows across the yard, he realized that the most powerful change had not been public recognition or altered perception, but the quiet realignment of values within his own family. The uniform he wore remained the same, still pressed, still slightly worn at the seams, yet the meaning attached to it had deepened not because of outside validation, but because those who once questioned it had learned to see beyond the surface. And as he prepared to return once more to the long stretch of highway leading back to base, Ethan carried with him not triumph, not vindication, but a steady assurance that character revealed in silence has a way of reshaping even the most entrenched judgments, one consistent step at a time. Autumn. Arrived gradually across Fort Bragg, the air sharpening in the early mornings and the trees along the perimeter road shifting from deep green to muted shades of gold and rust, and Ethan Walker found himself reflecting not on the night that had altered his family's perception, but on the steady pattern that had followed, the quiet reinforcement that change, when genuine, does not fade with time. Training cycles continued with precision, schedules mapped out weeks in advance, and Ethan moved through each day with the same deliberate calm, reviewing reports, walking the 2-mile stretch of field used for coordinated drills, and speaking with his unit about preparation and trust, never raising his voice, never relying on rank alone to command attention. Word of the banquet had circulated in small circles beyond his control, yet he neither encouraged nor discouraged it, because reputation built on a single moment cannot sustain itself without consistency to support it. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the high windows of the administrative building, he received an invitation from a local high school in Jefferson County asking if he would speak briefly at a career day event, and he paused before responding, aware that public appearances had never been his preference, yet understanding that quiet leadership sometimes requires visibility when it serves others. When he arrived at the school gymnasium a week later, dressed in the same carefully pressed uniform that had once drawn laughter, he stepped onto the polished floor not as a symbol of status but as an example of steadiness, addressing students about discipline, commitment, and the importance of choosing a path aligned with personal values rather than external approval. He spoke in measured tones, avoiding dramatic stories, emphasizing instead that success is often invisible in its early stages, that progress accumulates in daily effort rather than instant recognition, and he noticed several students listening with a focus that mirrored the attentiveness he saw in his unit. Among the audience sat his father and mother, who had taken seats near the back without announcing themselves, and as they watched him answer questions with humility and clarity, they saw not the comparison they once relied upon, but the quiet authority that had always been present beneath their assumptions. After the event concluded, Robert approached him with a handshake that held no tension, only pride grounded in understanding, and Linda embraced him briefly, her smile steady rather than uncertain. There were no references to past remarks, no need to revisit what had shifted, because the evidence stood plainly before them in the way their son carried himself, in the respect reflected in the eyes of strangers who had never known the earlier doubts. That evening, as Ethan drove back toward base with the sky streaked in deep orange and fading blue, he felt neither elevated nor vindicated, only aligned, aware that the most powerful transformation had not occurred in the banquet hall or beneath bright lights, but in the steady months that followed, where consistent action quietly reshaped perception. When he returned to his quarters, he placed his grandfather's folded flag carefully on a shelf above his desk, not as decoration but as reminder, and he understood that recognition may open a door, but character is what keeps it open. Outside, the wind moved gently across the training grounds, rustling fallen leaves along the pavement, and Ethan prepared for another early morning, knowing that the path ahead would look much like the days behind him, structured, disciplined, grounded in purpose, and that was enough. Winter settled over Fort Bragg with a quiet persistence, the mornings colder now, frost lining the edges of the training grounds as the sun rose slowly over the flat Carolina horizon, and Ethan Walker continued to move through each day with the same disciplined rhythm that had defined him long before anyone outside his unit had taken notice. The months had not transformed him into someone new, they had simply clarified what had always been there, and as he reviewed deployment schedules and finalized training evaluations inside his modest office, he felt no need to measure himself against memory or comparison. The folded flag from his grandfather remained on the shelf above his desk, not as a symbol of prestige but as a quiet reminder that legacy is carried forward through action rather than words. His father's weekly calls had become steady and unforced, conversations now grounded in genuine curiosity about leadership, about responsibility, about the patience required to guide others without seeking applause, and Ethan answered thoughtfully, offering insight without embellishment, aware that growth on both sides had taken root in silence rather than spectacle. One evening, as snow threatened in the forecast and the wind pressed sharply against the windows of the operations building, Ethan received formal notice that he had been selected to oversee a larger training command beginning in the spring, a role that would expand his influence across multiple units and require even greater coordination across miles of terrain and layers of accountability. He read the document carefully, absorbing its implications not with excitement but with measured understanding, recognizing that advancement is not a reward but an increase in responsibility. He did not immediately call his family, did not post announcements or share details beyond what was necessary, because he believed that milestones are best honored through continued diligence rather than public display. Weeks later, during a quiet Sunday visit home, he mentioned the assignment over coffee at the kitchen table, his tone steady, and this time there was no comparison, no uneasy laughter, only attentive listening. Robert nodded slowly, absorbing the information with visible respect, and Linda smiled with pride that felt settled rather than surprised. Daniel raised his cup in a small gesture of acknowledgement, not competitive, not distant, simply supportive. The conversation drifted naturally to practical matters, relocation timelines, new responsibilities, and the importance of preparation, and Ethan realized that the most meaningful transformation had not been the moment of recognition months earlier, but the sustained shift in perspective that followed. Later that afternoon, as he stood once more beneath the wide oak tree in the front yard, its branches bare against the pale winter sky, he reflected on how easily assumptions can define a person when viewed from the outside, and how quietly those assumptions can be undone through steady character. He did not resent the past, nor did he dwell on it, because he understood that respect earned through patience carries more permanence than respect demanded through argument. As evening approached and he prepared for the drive back to base, his mother handed him a small container of homemade cookies for the road, a simple gesture that felt more significant than any public praise, and his father clasped his shoulder firmly, the grip steady and sincere. The highway stretched ahead once more, miles marked by reflective signs and the steady hum of tires against asphalt, and Ethan drove with the same calm focus he had always possessed, aware that the road would continue to offer challenges, responsibilities, and quiet tests of integrity. Yet he no longer carried the weight of misunderstanding, because it had been replaced by something steadier, a mutual recognition that value is not defined by volume, nor by appearance, nor by comparison, but by consistency. As the lights of the base appeared faintly in the distance, he felt neither vindicated nor triumphant, only aligned with the path he had chosen years ago, understanding that the strongest statement a person can make is not spoken at all, but lived patiently, day after disciplined day.